Myst, the Book of Atrus continues, as read by the bathroom reader. I am covering for the plurality report, who is stressing that the character's name is Atrus, not Atrius or Atrus. Atrus. Yes. Chapter 17. Atrus stood there a long time after his father had gone, staring at the shadowed door in shock. He turned, looking across that huge, high-ceilinged space toward the desk. There lay the Age 5 book. A trap, he thought. Another door he'll hope I'll walk through. And when I do... Atrus heard again the slam of the door as his father closed it on him. He stepped out from beneath the great curved arch, the pinkish light of the lamp above giving his features a false glow of health. Beneath his feet, alternating black and white tiles, circles on squares, stretched away to every corner of that great space, while a large mosaic at the center portrayed Re-Neref, the most famous of all the Grand Masters of the Guild, his gray-bearded features somber, almost melancholic, as he stared back across the ages. The stone, once polished and beautiful, was webbed with tiny cracks, worn with age. A prison, Atrus thought, recognizing it for what it really was. The stone here was not the lavatic black used elsewhere in the house, but a dull, metallic gray, carved with intricate patterns, like lacework, great bulbous pillars holding up the massive arch of the roof. He had seen that same stone in some of the most ancient structures in the city, and realized that this was probably the oldest part of the house. How old, he wondered, 10, 20,000 years, or older yet? It was hard to tell. The Dani had built for eternity, not knowing that their days were numbered. Finally, in the northern corner of the chamber, beneath a massive arch, stood the locked doorway that led out of his prison, blood-red stone pillars standing like sentries to either side. Remembering what his father had said about the Dani love of secret passages, of doors in solid walls and tunnels through the rock, he began a search. Slowly, patiently, he went from arch to arch, searching each of the massive alcoves carefully, his fingers covering every inch of stone, as high as he could reach, right down to the floor. It took the best part of 2 hours, and though he found no secret doors or passages, it was still well worth the effort. In the floor of one of the more shadowy recesses, half embedded in the unfinished stone, he found a Dani stonecutter. It was a big old machine, like a massive crouching spider, and its power source was long exhausted, yet one of the cutting blades was as good as new. At first Atrus thought he might have to leave it there, it was so firmly wedged into the rock, but after half an hour of rocking it back and forth, he freed it from the stone. He lifted the heavy cutter, feeling its weight, then nodded to himself. The door was solid metal, and he would get nowhere trying to break through it, not even with this. But if he could chip away at the rock to either side, then maybe he wouldn't need to. Knowing there was no sense in delaying, he set to work at once. Taking off his top, he wrapped the cloth about the main body of the cutter, then went across and, kneeling in the deep shadow beside the door, began to attack the stone, low down and to his left. He could not properly see what he was doing, but after 10 minutes he stopped and, setting the cutter aside, checked with his fingers. It wasn't much of a notch, considering. In fact, he had barely chipped away more than a few flakes of the iron-tough stone. But at the top of that shiny, uneven depression, the stone had split. He traced the crack with his forefinger, then grinned. It was more than a foot long. Atrus turned, looking toward the desk. There was a lamp there, and fire marbles. Hurrying across, he brought them back, and, placing the lamp to one side so that it threw its light over the door, set to work again, aiming each blow at that split, aiming to widen it and crack the stone. The first few blows did nothing. Then, with a sharp cracking noise, the split widened dramatically. Atrus smiled and lifted the cutter again, meaning to extend the fissure, but even as he did, he heard the rock above him creak and groan. He looked up. In the light from the lantern he could see that the roof directly above him was badly cracked. Even as he looked, tiny splinters of rock began to fall as those cracks widened. Snatching up the lantern, Atrus scampered backward, and not a second too soon. With a great sigh, the two pillars collapsed inwardly, and a huge section of the roof caved in with a great crash. Atrus lay on his back, some dozen paces off, staring back at the great pile of rock that had fallen, the dust in the air making him cough violently. As the dust slowly settled, he saw that the door was totally blocked. He edged back, then got to his feet, sneezing and rubbing at his eyes. Now he'd done it. Now he was trapped here for sure. He coughed again, trying to clear his throat, then moved farther away, his eyes watering now. Trapped, yes, but at least there was one advantage to it. If he could not get out, then Gehn could not get in. Atrus turned, looking to the Age 5 book, and blinked, reassessing the situation. So just what did Gehn want? And why, if this was a prison, had he provided him with the means to escape, the book? Why give him pen and ink? And why provide him with a linking book from the 5th Age back to his chamber? A trap, he thought again. But now he wasn't quite so sure. Maybe his father had given him the book simply so he wouldn't starve. That thought intrigued him. He went over to the desk and stood there, staring down at the Age 5 book. At the very center of its cover was a circular metal medallion fixed to the leather by 5 tiny tacks. The Dawny number 5, a square halved by a narrow bar, was raised in metal above the porcelain base on which was engraved an intricate floral pattern. Atrus opened the book and looked at the descriptive panel. From the distant image it seemed a pleasant, peaceful place, the island heavily wooded. Yes, but what's the catch? For there had to be a catch. He knew that now. If he had learned one single thing today, it was that Gehn never, never did anything without some self-serving reason. It was many hours before he finally decided to venture into Gehn's 5th Age, deciding, before he did, that he would read it first, for if it really was a prison, he should at least know beforehand what kind of age he was to end his days in. For several hours he sat there, slowly leafing through the pages, noting all the flaws, all the possible contradictions that Gehn's particular writing style threw up. More than ever he could see his father's limited vision on every page, like a hideous tapestry quilted together from exquisite patches of silk. The entire work was short-sighted and disjointed, and yet it was also, paradoxically, quite clever, surprisingly so. Even so, it was one single thing which, in the end, caught Atrus's imagination, one element which made him catch his breath and make him want to go and see. The tree. Atrus sat back, amazed by the elegance, the sheer economy of the Dawny phrases that had described it, then leaned forward again, tracing each symbol with his finger, a thrill of pure aesthetic delight passing through him. A tree, a giant tree, whose topmost branches speared the sky. Atrus smiled at the thought, then read on, memorizing the details of the world, fixing them in his mind like the symbols on a map. And if it was a trap? He looked about him at the huge and gloomy chamber. Even if it was a trap, he would get to see the sun again, at least. And at least he would feel the wind upon his skin, the rain falling on his arms and upturned face, the sweet and gentle pleasure of bird song. For a moment he looked down, his face creased with pain at the memory of Solar and the old woman, recalling what had happened to their world. Never again, he swore, picking up the linking book, then opening the age 5 book to its descriptive page. Hesitating no longer, Atrus placed his hand against the image of the page. At once he felt the page expand. He had linked into a dense copse of tall, bearded grass which grew beside a circular pool that bulged strangely. He had stared at it, fascinated by the apparent motion of its convex surface. Then, hearing voices, had hurried from the spot quickly, making his way over a lightly wooded hill, then along a narrow dirt path that led steeply down a sheer cliff wall, dropping beneath an overhang of rock and down onto a rocky beach. An azure ocean lapped gently against the shore, washing over a line of smooth, tapered rocks that edged the beach like the teeth of some great submerged creature. There he paused, getting his breath, listening to the gentle slush and hiss of the sea. Turning, he looked about him, searching for somewhere safe to hide the linking book he'd brought. Almost at once his gaze fell on the sandstone cliff beneath the overhang, the face of which was pocked with hundreds of tiny holes. Atrus walked across and, choosing from among a number of likely candidates, picked one of the larger ones, some way up, well above what he saw was the normal tidal level. He glanced about him, then, convinced no one was watching, climbed up, using the lips of other holes as footholds. Squeezing his whole body into that narrow space, he crawled a little way along, then set the linking book down on the dry ledge, wedging it with a loose rock so that it wouldn't slide. Satisfied, he backed out, then jumped down onto the sand again, wiping his hands against his sides. He had noticed a sloping path around the edge of the enclosed bay, over to his left, and headed there now, picking his way slowly up the jumble of rock. For a moment he was in shadow, the rock ledge blocking his view of the sky. Then, as the path turned slightly, there was a break in the rock, and he came out into a sloping meadow. It was surprisingly windy. A strong, gusting breeze bent the heads of the long grass stalks and tugged at his cloak. Pulling it tight about him, Atrus walked on, head down, then, noticing how the shadow ended in a jagged line just ahead of him, he looked up. Slowly, very slowly, he turned to his right until he was facing it, his mouth fallen open in astonishment, his head going back to try to take it all in. The tree. It seemed to rest on a peninsula of rock, its roots, like the pillars of some huge stone temple, reaching down the cliff face to pierce the rock beneath, great humps of root, like the slick backs of a dozen massive sea serpents, stretching out into the ocean. Its trunk, likewise, was monumental. It was not by any means as tall as Atrus had imagined, yet the sheer breadth of it was enough to make him feel not simply small in its presence, but insignificant. Like time itself, Atrus thought, letting his eyes slowly climb its branches. Then, realizing how exposed he was to watchful eyes, he hurried on, making for the rock face just ahead. A set of steps were cut into rock, leading up through the trees, and there, in a clearing, the sunlight filtering down upon it through the treetops, was a large wooden hut. Atrus walked up to it, his heart hammering in his chest, recognizing it at once. It was like the meeting hut, Gehn's temple, on the 37th age, almost identical, in fact. Seeing it, Atrus knew suddenly exactly where he was on the island, picturing it in his mind as on a map. He stepped up into the cool interior, passing between the painted wooden poles and into a space that was furnished in the most luxurious manner imaginable, with marvelous tapestries and statuary and silver-poled banners lining the walls. At the far side of that shadowed space was a throne, a massive thing that looked as though it had been cast from a single piece of glowing gold. Coming closer, however, Atrus saw that it wasn't gold, but a beautiful tawny stone, the like of which he'd never seen, even in Dawny. Atrus stopped briefly to examine it, brushing his fingertips over the smooth, cool surface of the arm, wondering in which ancient book Gehn had found the formula or phrase to produce such a wondrous material. Behind the throne was a large freestanding screen, on the pale lemon silk of which was embroidered the silhouette of a man. That silhouette, with its high domed head and its familiar lenses, was unmistakable. It was Gehn. Atrus nodded to himself at this evidence of Gehn's presence. On how many other worlds had his father built such temples? In how many ages was that man a god? Knowing now what he would find, recalling all of this vividly from the Age 5 book, he went over to the screen and looked around it. There was a shadowy space beyond, a narrow set of steps leading down. He went down into the darkness. A low door, cut crudely from the rock, led to a long but narrow cave. From what he'd read, he knew that farther back, the walls that were pocked with thousands upon thousands of tiny holes, in much the same manner as the cliff face. It's there, he realized, peering through the half-light. Gehn's linking book is there. He was about to turn away, to go back through the temple and explore the woods surrounding it, when he remembered that the cave actually led somewhere. He couldn't recall exactly what it led to. There had been several areas in the Age 5 book where Gehn's phrasing was unclear, and this was one of them, but he had a definite recollection that it was important somehow. He walked on. The warm stuffiness of the cave was making him sweat, yet the cave was definitely leading somewhere. He might be imagining it, but just as the air grew constantly warmer, so there seemed to be a faint shimmering blue light in the tunnel now, enough to allow him to see a couple of feet in front of him. As he went on, the light grew until he found himself in a second smaller cave, filled with that same shimmering blue light. It was hot in the second cave, unbearably hot, steam rising from a great vent in the floor, but Atrus's eyes were drawn upward into the roof of the cave. There the most astonishing sight met his gaze. The flat gray rock of the ceiling was pierced at its center by a large, roughly circular hole, perhaps 8 or 10 feet in diameter. Within that hole, suspended above the cave, was a pool of water, its gently shimmering surface flush with the rock surrounding it. Beside it stood a metal ladder leading up into the pool. Atrus stared, open-mouthed. It was an illusion. It had to be. Yet if that were so, what power sustained it? He frowned, willing himself to understand. He walked across and stared. The massive natural vent glowed redly far below. He looked up into the pool. Sunlight was filtering down through the water, the curved walls of which seemed to form a kind of well. He narrowed his eyes, trying to estimate its length, but it was difficult to tell. He knew from his reading that the refractive quality of water could distort such things. Besides, who knew even if this was water? For when had he ever seen water behave in such a fashion? Up there on the far side of that unnatural barrier, however, there was something. There had to be. Or why the ladder? Atrus stepped over to the ladder, taking hold of it, determinedly. How far is it? He wondered, pausing, his head only inches beneath that strangely quivering surface. 20 feet? 30? Raising his right hand, he tentatively immersed it in the pool. It was extremely warm and felt like water, except that when he withdrew his hand, the drips flew upward, merging with the pellucid surface of the pool. Atrus closed his eyes, then pushed up, immersing his head and shoulders. For 5 full seconds he held himself there, then ducked down again, sputtering. There, he told himself, opening his eyes wide and drawing a hand back through his sodden hair, grinning to himself. He closed his eyes again and counted, taking slow, calming breaths. At 20 he thrust upward, dragging himself up the last few feet of the ladder with his hands. And then, suddenly, he was fully immersed. Opening his eyes, he let go of the ladder and kicked, reaching up instinctively, trying to claw his way to the surface. Slowly, very slowly, it came toward him, the walls sliding past. His lungs were aching now, but he was very nearly there. And then, suddenly, there was a shadow on the sunlit surface just above him, the outline of a human figure. He tried to hold back, putting out his arms, trying to slow his upward drift, fighting to stay where he was, but it was impossible, and in the struggle something gave. The sudden choking pain was awful. It was like swallowing hot tar. His lungs were suddenly on fire, his mind flaring like a bonfire with the pain. He spasmed and threw his arms out, trying to grasp the edges of that strange, unnatural well, yet even as he did, the blackness leaked in again, robbing him of consciousness. Slowly, arms out, he floated to the surface of the circular pool he had seen when he first arrived. The hut was dark after the bright sunlight of the bay, and as Katrin sat herself in the corner, out of the way of her 2 cousins, who were tending to the stranger, it took a while for her eyes to adjust to the shadows. At first they had thought he was dead. It was the strangest thing they had ever seen. They were reluctant to take him from the water. His flesh was pale and corpse-like, and there had been no pulse at his neck. The old man, Hrea, had advocated throwing him back into the water, but her eldest cousin, Karel, had persevered, pushing the water from out of the stranger's chest and breathing his own air into the youth's blue mouth until, with a choking sound and the expulsion of a plentiful amount of water, the corpse had begun to breathe again. They had wrapped the stranger in a blanket, then carried him back to the hut. That had been this morning. In the hours between, the stranger had slept, at first lightly, feverishly, but then peacefully. For the last few hours, Karel and his younger brother, Erlar, waited for the stranger to wake. "How long?" she asked impatiently. The Dani she spoke clearer, less accented than theirs. Karel, who was standing beside the bed, looked to her across the full length of the room and shrugged, but Erlar, who was at the stove, preparing a pot of soup, smiled and said gently, "Not long now, Katrin. Let him sleep a little longer. If he doesn't come around soon, we'll wake him." "Is there any damage?" At that, Erlar looked to Karel. "It's hard to say," Karel answered. "Who is he?" she asked, posing the question that all of them had asked in their minds. "Do you think he belongs to Gehn?" "One of his servants, you mean?" Karel sighed, then shrugged. "I don't know. He has a pair of eye instruments like Gehn's." "Eye instruments?" She sat forward slightly. "I didn't see them." No, they were in the pocket of his cloak. Carell reached across and took them from the table beside the bed. Here. She took them and studied them, remembering what she'd been told by Erlar about the stranger's first appearance among them. Unearthly white, his arms spread as if to embrace them as they knelt there looking down. Katrin studied the lenses a moment longer, then handed them back. Is he marked? Carell shook his head. There's nothing on his neck. Unconscious of the gesture, she put her hand to her own neck, her fingers tracing the box-like symbol imprinted in the flesh. Then maybe... Both cousins looked at her, waiting for her to go on, but she merely shook her head. Erlar smiled, and then looked back at the pot he was stirring. He was talking in his sleep earlier. Talking? Katrin stared at her cousin, her deeply green eyes intent. He was murmuring something about flowers. Her narrow mouth opened, the lips barely parting. Then she turned her head, anxiously looking across to where the stranger lay on his back on the wooden bed. There was a faint groan, a movement of the body. Katrin half stood, then sat again. Carell, beside the body, reached down and, dipping the flannel in the bucket by his side, wrung it out, then began to wipe the stranger's brow, as he'd done now many times. Yet even as he did, the youth's hand came up and firmly held his wrist. Carell swallowed nervously as the young man opened his eyes. There was a surprise in those pale, yet clearly human eyes, fear and curiosity. Where am I? Carell made no attempt to free his hand. You are on Riven, in the village. Riven? Yes, Riven, Carell repeated, that one word sounding strange among the heavily accented Donny words. We found you in the pool. You were in a bad way. The water had got inside you. The young man's eyes opened wide, suddenly remembering. The pool. Are you hungry? Hungry? The stranger nodded. Famished. Good. Carell looked to his younger brother and gave a nod. At the signal, Erlar poured soup into a large wooden vessel and, after sprinkling a measure of dark powder into it, carried it across. Here, Erlar said, holding it out, as Carell helped the young man sit up, placing 2 pillows behind his back, between him and the wooden headboard. Thank you, the stranger said, taking the bowl. After sniffing it, he began to spoon it into his mouth, slowly at first, then with an appetite that made the brothers look to each other and smile. Would you like some more? Erlar asked, taking the empty bowl back from him. Please. They watched, astonished, as he ate a second bowl, and then a third. Then, drowsy once more, the effort, it seemed, too much for him. He slept again. And all the while, Katrin sat there in the corner, her green eyes watching. Atrus woke with a start as if he'd fallen in his sleep, conscious of the unfamiliar, yet not unpleasant smell of the shadowed place in which he found himself. Turning onto his side, he stretched, then lay still, hearing voices from outside. He remembered now, the 2 young men who'd sat there while he ate, smiling kindly at him. He smiled himself at the thought. What had they called this place? Riven. That was it. Gehn's 5th age. He yawned, then lay still again, staring at the far wall. It was a simple mud and daub hut, not so dissimilar from those on the 37th age, but bigger and with a finish to the walls that spoke of a high level of technical skill. And they had stoves, too, cast metal stoves which they cooked. That spoke of complexities to this age that age 37 did not have. They would have to have a supply of metal, yes, and the skills to use it. His eyes went to the stove, noting its simple, unadorned shape, so unlike all of the Donny artifacts he was used to. Such simplicity appealed to him. Idly, his eyes traveled upwards, searching the shadows of the ceiling, curious to see what kind of structure this was, what materials they used here. So much of this, as ever, had not been in the descriptive book. Only the building blocks were there in Gehn's Age 5 book. the basic elements from which the complexities of such cultures developed. That thought fascinated him. It made him think of subtle ways he himself might have influenced the mix, what factors he personally would have built into the equation of this age. His eyes traveled down from the shadows, noting the simple square-cut window, the undecorated plainness of the whitewashed wall, then stopped, surprised to find the eyes of a young woman staring back at him. Green eyes, startlingly green eyes. For a moment he simply stared, his lips slightly parted, taking in the strange, almost delicate beauty of her face. Then, realizing what he was doing, he averted his eyes, suddenly acutely embarrassed. How long has she been there? He wondered. How long has she been watching me? He heard her footsteps on the bare earth floor. You almost died, she said. What were you doing in the pool? Atrus turned to find her kneeling beside the bed, her face almost on a level with his own. He found that strangely disconcerting, as if she were some kind of threat to him. Unlike the young men who had nursed him, her face was tense, almost ill-humored. I don't know, he answered. She blinked, then looked away, allowing Atrus the chance to study her. The others had been tanned, and so was she, but he noticed that the skin of her lower arms was strangely banded, pale and tanned, as if she had, at some point, placed strips of cloth about them to create that pattern. She was wearing a simple dark green dress. There were tiny white feathers braided into her hair, and about her neck was a wide, embroidered choker. But his gaze kept returning to her eyes, which were deep and mysterious, so deep and dark. Where did you come from? She asked, her face still turned from his. Another place, he said, thinking that it could do no harm, but he could see that his answer didn't satisfy her. There was a flash of irritation in her eyes. Atrus sensed as much as she stood and turned away from him. He risked a tiny glance. There was something tense about the way she stood there, her head slightly tilted forward, her hands up to her mouth. She turned back, focusing those dark eyes on him once again. What's your name? Atrus. What's yours? Katrin. He nodded. Catherine. That's Katren, she said again, placing the emphasis on the final syllable. I dreamed of you. You dreamed? Then, without another word, she turned and quickly left the hut, leaving the door wide open, the sunlight spilling in a wide bar of gold that climbed the far wall. Atrus lifted his head, staring at the doorway, wondering what all that had been about. Then, swallowing, his throat strangely dry, he let his head fall back.